Now, let's begin our history of psychology, racism, and the United States. We will begin our history with the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And here is a famous painting by John Trumbull depicting the First Continental Congress signing the Declaration of Independence. Now, of course, a painting like this only gives us a picture of how the artist imagined things might have looked. But there is one thing about this painting that I suspect is highly accurate. So, in what way is this painting probably accurate? Now, recall what had happened up to this point. People in the colonies were angry about taxes being imposed by Britain. This led to protests and then to violent confrontations, and there were events like the famous Boston Tea Party. So then a group called the Continental Congress got together, and they met to discuss what to do about these conflicts with Britain. And the Continental Congress included representatives from each colony, and eventually they signed a document that was written mostly by Thomas Jefferson, and this document was called the Declaration of Independence. And in this document, they declared that the colonies were independent from Britain. Now, the signing of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776 is typically regarded as the beginning of the United States. Although this is somewhat of an arbitrary event in a long series of things that led to the formation of the United States, and the Declaration of Independence wasn't really signed on July 4th, but instead it was adopted and debated and signed over a span of several days. Now, back to the question, in what way is this painting likely to be notably accurate? Well, the painting is likely to be accurate in depicting the types of people who were members of the Continental Congress. So, who were the members of the Continental Congress? Well, these were all relatively wealthy, upper-class, white males. There were no black people, there were no Native Americans, and there were no women. In addition, there were not any poor people or lower-class people or uneducated people. These are men wearing white silk stockings and fancy shoes with silver buckles. Many wore powdered white wigs that were fashionable at this time. Now, on the one hand, the Declaration of Independence was based on what are called Enlightenment ideas. Ideas that all people are equal and that all people should have a voice in government. On the other hand, they had a very narrow view regarding who should be included in all people. It is notable that most men in this picture owned human slaves. And so to a large extent, when they were thinking of all people, they were thinking primarily of white males. And maybe specifically they were thinking of white males that were wealthy enough to own property. Then, after the Declaration of Independence was signed, there was a Revolutionary War that lasted about 5 years. Here is a famous painting by Emanuel Leutze of George Washington and his Continental Army crossing the Delaware River. And aside from this being a beautiful work of art, it is also a good example of, well, the unrealistic and glorified history of heroes to which people are often drawn. George Washington is depicted in a heroic pose, and not only would this pose be quite difficult to maintain on a small boat, but the painting does not really capture the historical reality that, at this point in time, things were going very badly for George Washington and his Continental Army. Although the war began with a victory, there was one night when the Continental Army snuck cannons to the top of a hill overlooking Boston Harbor, and that forced the British to evacuate the city. But then, after that point, everything went terribly. The Continental Army suffered an extensive loss when they tried to defend New York City. They barely escaped, and the British took control of the city. Then, Washington's army spent a cold winter in New Jersey, where the army was in tatters and disease was rampant, and the Continental Congress didn't have enough money, and the army didn't have enough food, and they didn't have enough clothing, and they were short on ammunition, and many men were deserting the army. Now, it was during this winter that George Washington managed to cross the Delaware River during the night and make a successful surprise attack on a British garrison at Trenton. And then they retreated back to their winter quarters. But then the next summer, the British took control of Philadelphia, which was then currently serving as a capital, so members of the Continental Congress had to flee. So overall, things were not going well for the Continental Army. Now, eventually, of course, France enters the war to help the colonies, and after several years of fighting, Washington forced the British to surrender at Yorktown in 1781, and then a treaty was signed in 1783. And notably, these might have been more realistic dates to designate as the beginning of the United States. Now, many of the historical events that I will be discussing in the series will involve the United States government. So it will be good to set the stage for this history by first clarifying where this government came from. Many of the things that we may think of as defining features of the United States government are things that had not even been dreamed up at the time of the Revolution. We did not yet have our Constitution or a Bill of Rights. All we had after the Revolution was something called the Articles of Confederation, and this simply stated that the 13 states were supposed to cooperate in a kind of league of friendship with each other. But this gave almost no power at all to the federal government. The federal government could request money from the states, but it could not impose taxes. And because states generally failed to voluntarily give money, the federal government was near broke, and it could not pay debts from the war that were owed to other countries, and it could not provide payment owed to veterans for their service in the Revolutionary War. Also, the federal government could not regulate interstate commerce, so states began imposing tariffs on each other, and this started leading to economic chaos. The federal government also could not compel states to make military contributions, and this left the United States vulnerable to attack from other countries. On the screen is a picture of a political cartoon from this era depicting the problems with the Articles of Confederation. There's a wagon full of debt stuck in the mud as people argue about what to do. So very soon it became apparent that with the Articles of Confederation, it might be difficult for the United States to survive, and it was certainly difficult for wealthy white men to prosper. So, in 1787, delegates met in Philadelphia to fix the Articles of Confederation. However, the agenda for this meeting was controlled by a group of people called the Federalists. And the Federalists wanted to scrap the Articles of Confederation altogether, and they wanted to establish an entirely new system of government that had a much stronger federal government. The Federalists included people like George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, and also James Madison, who eventually drafted a new constitution that the Federalists wanted the United States to adopt. Now, although some delegates strongly opposed the Federalists, and these delegates wanted individual states to retain much more of their power, and although there were long, contentious debates, eventually the Federalists prevailed, and the delegates adopted the Constitution. This Constitution was then ratified by most states in 1788, but many states raised strong objections about the power that was given to the federal government, and to address these concerns, eventually a Bill of Rights was added. So finally, in 1789, that is, 13 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the first Congress of the United States met, and George Washington was elected president. He was then inaugurated with a great big celebration at Federal Hall in New York City. Notably, this is another date that could have been used to designate the beginning of the United States.
Clothing from cloth of calico cotton, it ruled the world, economy grand, and those who could ignored what the
Now, if we want to be understanding and helpful to people today, we need to be aware of issues of diversity, and we need to be aware of situations where there are power systems that maintain the power and privilege of some people and exploit and oppress other people. And we need to be aware of issues involving race and how people that might fit different race categories have been treated very differently and have very different life experiences. And we need to be aware of racism. And one way to be aware of all these issues is to understand their history and how things like racism and privilege and power systems have been a part of the entire history of the United States. And I think the more we understand of the history of these issues, the better we can also understand people's experiences today. And one of the key foundations of all these issues is the history of slavery in the United States. So let's consider, at the time when the United States first became a new nation, say around the time of the Revolution, to what extent was slavery already an established institution at that time? Now, way back in 1619, there were about 20 black slaves were brought to Jamestown. And that is sometimes given as the official start date of slavery in the British colonies. Although notably, Europeans had been bringing African slaves to the continent even well before that, just since shortly after Columbus's voyage in 1492. So we can say around the time of the Revolution, depending on how you count it, slavery had already been an institution in the United States for the past 150 to 250 years prior to the start of the United States. So it had been going on for a long time. At the time of the Revolution, African American slaves comprised about 20% of the United States population. Most were in the South, but not all. We had slaves who were in all of the colonies, although most were in the South. And at this point in history, cotton had not yet become a major crop to grow in the United States. So slaves were not so much growing cotton at this point in history. That would become important very shortly in our history. But around the time of the Revolution, tobacco and rice were the key crops that slaves were involved in growing, which were also very labor-intensive crops to grow. Cotton would be labor-intensive as well. So slavery was definitely well established when our country started. And here is a picture of an advertisement from just slightly before the Revolutionary War for someone who was selling slaves from Africa. And note that when the United States adopted its new Constitution, that slavery was essentially written into the Constitution. There is the 3/5 rule. That is a rule that states that a slave counts as 3/5 of a person. So when you're doing a census, counting how many people are in a state, which was important for determining how many delegates you had in Congress, that slaves could not vote, of course, but when you were counting how many people you had in your state, the agreement was that you counted each slave as 3/5 of one person. And I mentioned that all of the colonies and then the states initially had slaves in them, but after the Revolutionary War, many of the northern states began abolishing slavery. And over the next 30 years, it took a while, but over the next 30 years, eventually slavery was abolished in the North, but it stayed a very powerful and dominant institution in the southern states. And here is a picture painted by a white plantation owner from South Carolina from shortly after the Revolutionary War, depicting the life of the slaves on his plantation. And it is interesting to look at this picture and get a sense of how this plantation owner viewed his slaves. There are certainly some stereotypical depictions in this picture, and the slaves all look relatively happy. What I really wished we had was a painting from a slave's point of view, depicting what slavery was like and what life on a plantation was like. To my knowledge, such a painting doesn't exist. Now, at this point in time, the white intellectuals and academic people in the United States and in Europe had a lot of theories about race. And to talk about these theories and to talk about the history of racism, I'm going to draw quite a bit from the historian and author Ibram X. Kendi. And so drawing from Kendi's work, at this point in history, there were two dominant intellectual theories about race. And we could call these theories the Polygenesis theory and the Monogenesis theory. And now both of these theories are going to propose that white people are superior to black people, and they're all going to portray African culture as uncivilized. That was essentially just a common view that almost all white people had in the United States and Europe at this point in history. And the difference between these two theories are going to be whether white and black people are one species or two different species, whether they all go back to the same ancestor or whether they were derived from two different ancestors. So the polygenesis theory is a theory that everyone, or that white people and black people have two different ancestors that were two different species. And the monogenesis theory is essentially a theory that white and black people all have a common ancestor, but something happened, like maybe it's the climate in Africa or some other factor made black people inferior to white people. In general, Christian leaders at this point in history tended to favor the monogenesis theory to some extent because the story of Adam and Eve implied that all people came from a common ancestor. So that tended to be favored in a lot of Christian circles, but not necessarily. And in terms of academics, some people favored polygenesis, some people favored monogenesis, but both theories depicted black people as being inferior to white people. And here's another painting from about the same time in history, a painting made by a white person depicting slavery at the time. And I just mentioned that the white academics and intellectuals at this time in history had two dominant theories about race, which we called monogenesis and polygenesis. And now I want to note two different types of racism. And we'll use these two types of racism to describe racism throughout the history of the United States. And one type of racism we'll call segregationist, and the other will be assimilationist. And basically, segregationist racism is the idea that black people cannot ever have equality with white people. And this would often go with the idea of polygenesis, thinking that black people and white people come from two different species, and so therefore they can never be equal because they're inherently different from each other. In contrast, the assimilationist point of view would say that black people and white people are currently not equal, and that currently white people are superior to black people. But if black people improve and become more like white people, then eventually they could be equal. And that is typically paired with the monogenesis idea, the idea that maybe everyone goes back to the same ancestor, something like maybe bad climate in Africa caused black people to be inferior, but now if they can overcome those previous difficulties, then they may become more like white people eventually. And at the top of this slide, I clarify the distinction between the segregationist and assimilationist points of view. So the segregationist point of view would say that black and white people can never be equal. It tends to favor the polygenesis theory, thinking that black people and white people are two different species. And people who are segregationists are often very strongly in favor of slavery. There tends to be a very strong pro-slavery viewpoint. The assimilationist point of view was the one that they thought that black people and white people were not currently equal to each other, and they thought that white people were currently superior, but they saw the potential for future equality. And they tended to favor the monogenesis theory, thinking that black people and white people all came from the same ancestor, and with the belief that, well, we don't think they're currently equal to each other, but maybe in the future they could become equal because they all were all part of the same species. Interestingly, part of the assimilationist viewpoint thought that maybe if black people improved themselves, that they would become more like white people. And not only that, they would actually become white. They actually had some ideas that as black people got better, their skin color might change and they might become more white in appearance. And actually, they looked at that some black people can have an albino skin condition. And at that point in time, people saw that and thought that was evidence maybe of black people that are turning white in their skin color because they're improving. So the idea was that maybe it was the climate in Africa or something that hampered people, so that over time, people in that part of the world had black skin and they became inferior. But if they live in better parts of the world and improve themselves, maybe their skin will become whiter and they will become equal to white people. Eventually, was how that theory went. One theme we will be talking about here and throughout our entire series here is this idea of uplift suasion. And uplift suasion is an attitude that would fit with the assimilationist point of view. And it would be the idea that although black people are currently inferior, they need to improve themselves and enhance themselves to make themselves more and more like white people. And if they do that well enough, then white people will be convinced that black people are their equals and they will no longer be prejudiced. So it's kind of the idea of white people are prejudiced against black people because black people are currently inferior. But if black people engage in this uplift suasion, if they make themselves better and show white people how much better they are, then white people will no longer need to be prejudiced, and then everyone can be equal. And that is the racist idea of uplift suasion that would fit within this assimilationist viewpoint. The idea that there could be that black people and white people are not currently equal to each other, but they could be in the future, they could be equal. Now, note, at this point in history, there are very, very few people that would be abolitionists, people that would be against slavery. But the few that were against slavery would have fit with the assimilationist point of view. So there was really no one saying we're against slavery because we think black people and white people are currently equal to each other. But there were a lot of people that thought, well, black people and white people are all the same species, and if given the opportunity, black people could improve themselves, and so therefore we should get rid of slavery. So the people that were against slavery, the abolitionists, the few that there were at this point in history, were generally from an assimilationist point of view. So they were abolitionists, but they were also racist in their type of thinking. And actually, here is a picture down at the bottom that was painted from the abolitionist movement. Actually, it was from Britain. There was a report, and this is the type of thing that would certainly happen all the time, a very common thing, of sexual exploitation of slaves. A report of a slave girl on a ship that was killed because she refused to dance naked for the white men on the ship. And a person drew a picture of that to illustrate it, to show the evils of slavery for the abolitionist movement. So that's the difference between the segregationist and the assimilationist points of view. Now, what about George Washington? How should we judge George Washington on his treatment of slaves? Because he did own several hundred slaves that he had enslaved at his plantation at Mount Vernon. And I have a note here that once George Washington extracted teeth from a slave to use for his own dentures. Washington had lifelong troubles with his teeth and tried many different types of dentures to try to have teeth for his mouth. I believe it caused him a lot of pain throughout his life. And at one point, he extracted teeth from a slave to use for his own dentures. I believe he actually did pay the slave some money for the teeth, but the slave had no choice. They were extracted by force. I have a note here of some of the different punishments that George Washington used at his Mount Vernon plantation. So he did whip slaves and he did give them, sometimes if they didn't perform well, he'd give them very taxing, difficult work assignments as punishment. And he often, as punishment, would sell a slave to the West Indies, which would cause a permanent separation from family and friends. So he owned slaves. He extracted teeth from a slave once. He used very severe punishments for slaves. Notably, on the other hand, he actually did not require his slaves to work on Sundays. And when George Washington died, he did free all the legally eligible slaves, which was about 123 people. It wasn't all, I think there were several hundred on the plantation for various legal reasons. Some weren't allowed to be freed, but everyone that he could free, not when he was alive, but when he died, he had about 123 slaves were freed upon his death.
They sold for their hands. Hold this remembrance of the breaking of bread for the poor and the captive, for those now oppressed. A wailing mother, a baby stolen, blood from whips that tear the flesh, for cotton growing. A wailing mother, a baby stolen, blood from whips that tear the flesh, for cotton growing.
Now, I'm going to be focusing mostly on history in the United States, but a lot of the things I'll be talking about, and especially when we talk about the history of psychology, we'll be talking about things that started in Europe and then were imported to the United States. So it will be good to also consider the question, what was going on in Europe around the time? So around the time of the American Revolution, what was happening in Europe? And one of the things that was happening in Europe is that there was a revolution in France. Shortly after the American Revolution, there was the French Revolution. And in France, there was King Louis XVI, and he had engaged in a lot of extravagant spending of money, including money that he spent to try to help the American Revolution and the Continental Army. And that led to a terrible economic situation in France, and there was a lot of poverty. One story is, I don't know if it's really true or not, but supposedly the story goes, the people in France were complaining about the poverty and not being able to even have bread to eat. And supposedly King Louis's queen, Marie Antoinette, said, well, let them eat cake. So anyway, there was a lot of unrest. There was this popular insurgency that was based on Enlightenment ideals. It was actually some of the same ideals that the American Revolution was based on, where people were thinking along the ideas of we shouldn't be governed by a dictator or a king, and that all people are created equal. And of course, when they were thinking about all people being created equal, they sometimes had a very limited idea of who was included in all people. But anyway, there were these Enlightenment ideals about new types of government and equality among persons. And that same Enlightenment movement that led to the American Revolution also led to a revolution in France. And on July 14th in 1789, as we depicted in this picture here, supposed to be the storming of the Bastille. There was a Bastille fortress that had gunpowder and weapons, and the rebels stormed the Bastille to get the weapons. And that date is often celebrated in France as Bastille Day. Eventually the rebels was successful, and they overthrew the monarchy, and a republic was established. And that new republic actually turned rather ugly very quickly, because then the new republic started executing and killing all the people from the former government. That period of time is often called the Reign of Terror, and they used guillotines to cut off people's heads, including they executed King Louis was killed, his wife Marie Antoinette were killed, and many, many other people associated with that government got killed. And then just about a year later, 1799, that new republic didn't last long, because Napoleon Bonaparte staged a coup and overthrew that republic, and he became dictator, and France was once again ruled by a dictator. Now it was Napoleon who was ruling France. And Napoleon had a lot of military ambitions that would come into play in the years to come in Europe. And as I just mentioned, a lot of the psychological ideas and theories that became popular in the United States are things that originated in Europe. And so let's go over to Britain and take a look at one of those early psychological ideas. Now, of course, at this point in history, around the time of the American Revolution, there was no such thing as psychology. That is, psychology as a formal academic discipline didn't develop for about another 100 years or so. But there were certainly a lot of people that wrote about psychological topics. And one group of people were the British associationists. And the British associationists were interested in trying to understand where all of our ideas come from, where our thoughts and ideas come from. I think they would have defined our ideas as all the stuff that's in our conscious experience or our conscious awareness. And their theory was that all of our ideas essentially come from our sensory experiences, that we touch things, feel, smell, see, hear, that our sensory experiences give us the basic building blocks that get then turned into ideas that get combined together to form other ideas and thoughts to make up all the stuff that's in our conscious experience. Part of their theory has to do with how our thoughts or ideas get associated with each other and connected together built into larger and larger ideas. And that's where the term British associationists, that's why they're called associationists, because their theory has to do with how ideas get associated with each other. One of the very first British associationists is John Locke. He's probably the best known British associationist, and he's famous for his basic theory that when we're born as a blank slate. That is, we're born with no innate abilities or traits. We're born as a blank slate with the potential to become anything. And then through our sensory experiences that we have, gives us the stuff we have to build our thoughts and ideas. And so we become who we are. That is, we have all the thoughts that we have in our conscious experience as a result of our sensory experiences that we experience throughout our entire lifetime. So in terms, if we were to use the nature versus nurture language, which they would not have used at this point in history, but they would have said that it's all nurture, it's all life experience, specifically our sensory experiences that we have that lead to who we become and all of the thoughts that we have. And that nature, that is what we're born with, or innate traits and abilities, has nothing to do with who we become, would be essentially what their theory was. And in 1738, this guy right here, David Hume, published a book on the Treatise of Human Nature, and he was a British associationist proposing these types of ideas. And around the time of the Revolution, David Hume's book would have been somewhat of a popular book if you were an academic, intellectual type of person. There weren't very many of those around, but if you were an intellectual person around this time in history, you might have read David Hume's book on the Treatise of Human Nature. So to get a sense as to what types of psychological theories were popular at this point in history, let's take a closer look at what exactly David Hume thought. So in his book, David Hume proposed that the human mind, which is a lot of the early psychological theories were trying to understand this thing they called the human mind. And he said that the mind is comprised of two types of perceptions. And he called one impressions and the other was ideas. So impressions are essentially the immediate sensations and perceptions that we have when we experience something. So if I walk outside and say it's hot outside and I have the experience of feeling hot and I feel the warmth and maybe I have a desire to go someplace cool, that my sensations and my feelings and my desires when I walk outside and feel hot could be impressions. Or maybe I listen to some relaxing music and I find that music to be soothing and calming. So I'd have sensations, I'd hear the music, I'd feel soothed, and maybe my desire is to listen to more music. So impressions are essentially the immediate and strong sensations, feelings, and desires that I experience when I'm immediately experiencing something in my environment. And then ideas are essentially when I remember those sensations and think back. So I can recall an experience of being hot, or I can imagine an experience of listening to music. So the ideas are the memories or the imagination that we have of things that we experienced previously, of those impressions. So ideas, according to Hume, are copies of impressions, and they're weaker than impressions. The impressions are the immediate, strong, and clear sensations and feelings, and the ideas are essentially weaker impressions of our previous weaker copies of our impressions. And according to Hume, all of our thought, everything that's in our mind, every thought that we have is limited to recombining elements derived from impressions. So we have these initial impressions that we experience, and those impressions are then combined in different ways to create ideas, and every idea in one way or another links back to impressions. In other words, impressions are based on experience, and so this goes back to the idea that experience is everything. Our sensations and our perceptions and our experiences that we have in life form these impressions. The impressions lead to ideas, and the ideas are comprised of nothing but impressions. So therefore, all of what our mind is based on our experience. It all goes back to experience. He went further to suggest that we can talk about different types of perceptions that are either complex, contain many parts, which can be broken down into single parts, which are simple perceptions. So he talked about complex and simple perceptions. And he talked about how the complex perceptions are formed by combining these different parts in things like, if two things resemble each other, they might get combined. Or if two things are contiguous to each other, they're next to each other, they might get combined. It's like, oh, these two things go together, so I put them together as a single idea. If we notice things that appear to be cause and effect, we put them together. So it was an idea of, part of his psychology was trying to develop a theory of how we have these simple perceptions and what are the rules that our mind uses to combine these simple perceptions together to form what he called complex perceptions. And that was essentially the gist of what his theory was looking at. So in summary, David Hume's theory is looking at how complex ideas get formed from simple ideas, or things that we might call sensations and perceptions, and how our sensations and perceptions, or these simple ideas, get combined when things resemble each other, when we have two similar resembling types of sensations, or things are contiguous next to each other, or when there is some kind of a cause and effect relationship, that causes our simple ideas to get combined into complex ideas. And this is actually the key reason why this type of theory is called associationism, because it's looking at how the ideas get associated with each other, how they get combined together. So looking at how the ideas get associated and combined is a key feature of British associationism. And as I also mentioned, another key feature of British associationism is the idea that the blank slate, that all of what we are is based on experience, and we don't inherit anything. And that everyone is born as a blank slate with a potential to become just about anything based on our experience. And from that point of view, you might expect the British associationists to have a relatively non-racist viewpoint. But that is not correct. Their viewpoint was still actually very racist. In fact, David Hume supported polygenesis. He thought that black people and white people were two different species. Down at the bottom of the slide, I have a quote from one of his books published in 1753, where he says, "I am apt to suspect that the Negroes, and in general all the other species of men, for there are 4 or 5 different kinds, to be naturally inferior to the whites. There never was a civilized nation of any other complexion than white, nor even any individual eminent, either in action or speculation." So David Hume supported polygenesis, which notably, this is one of those things that if you read the history of psychology and the history of academics, this is one of the things that is often left out. I actually had to dig a little bit to find what David Hume actually thought about race. It wasn't a easy thing to find offhand. And if you look at a lot of textbooks, they talk about, here's David Hume's theory about British associationism, but they often don't talk about what he thought about race and the fact that he, like a lot of academics, supported polygenesis. And I think it's important to look at that as we're telling our history of psychology, to also pay attention to what did people think about race. And as we go along here, we're going to find out that pretty much in one way or another, all of our white academic psychologists or people that were academics had racist types of viewpoints. So around the time of the American Revolution, what would have people understood about how the nervous system works? How much would have they understood about the importance of the brain or the function of the brain? And so at this time, people would have understood that the brain is important for thought and thinking, but otherwise their understanding of the nervous system would have been very limited. And let me talk about a couple discoveries that were made around this time that will give us a sense of both what was unknown and what was currently being discovered around the time of the Revolution. And here I have a picture. I believe this person's name is pronounced Robert White. And before the Revolution, actually I think it was like 1751 or so, he published a paper that I have here, this of the vital and other involuntary motions of the animals. And I have a picture of a frog over here that doesn't have a head, or a head taken off there, because what he did is he decapitated frogs and noted that when he decapitated them, they still had reflexes. Muscles still moved. And so he concluded that there must be some kind of a certain power in the nerve system that is a cause or a necessary condition for muscle contraction. So his basic conclusion was, I cut off the frog heads, and this frog muscles still move, and I assume that there's nerves involved in this movement, so there must be some kind of power in the nerves. Now, this is long before we have any notion about how nerves work, not talking about neurotransmitters, not talking about action potentials. At this point, not even noting that it's an electrical chemical or an electric type of movement, just that there's some kind of power in the nerves that must be important for muscle movement. And that was his discovery from decapitating frogs. Then, moving to a few years after the American Revolution, in Italy, there was this guy, Luigi Galvani. I believe it's the same person that the galvanic skin response is named after. And Luigi Galvani had a very interesting way of entertaining his dinner guests. So he was familiar with Benjamin Franklin's experiments on electricity, and he strung a wire from his laboratory roof to capture static electricity from clouds as they passed by, and then connected that wire to his laboratory. And he took a frog and cut off the legs here, which is shown in this picture here, and took these frog legs and hooked them up to the wire. And as clouds moved over, the electrically charged clouds sent electricity down and made the frog legs move. And supposedly that was part of how he brought dinner guests over. Then after dinner, they said, hey, let me show you the stuff. I'll hook these frog legs up to this wire, and they start twitching. And isn't that fascinating? And so in 1791, he published his results about his twitching frog legs. And note, we're starting to advance here from, we started off with White's conclusion that there's a certain power in the nerves. We don't know much about what it is. And now Luigi Galvani publishes results that would suggest this power in the nerves has something to do with electricity, because when I hook it up to these wires, we get this electric charge that makes the legs move. And so whatever this power is in the nerves, this power probably has something to do with electricity. And so that is about the state of understanding of the nervous system around the time of the American Revolution. So around the time of the American Revolution, I would imagine that the common person, most people, were not really familiar with David Hume's theory or with British associationism, and they probably weren't familiar with research on the nervous system and weren't familiar with how Luigi Galvani entertained his dinner guests. So what would be some theories about psychology that more common people might have been familiar with? That is, what were some things we might call a version of popular psychology around the time of the American Revolution? So one theory that was somewhat popular was the theory of physiognomy. So what is physiognomy? So physiognomy is essentially the idea that we can judge people's personalities by their physical appearance. And I guess it was 1775, for example, Johann Lavater wrote his essays on physiognomy, and it's a book about how we can tell people's personalities based on their appearances. Here are some illustrations from the book. These silhouettes over here on the right are different silhouettes of different people, and the book talks about how you can judge personality. Each silhouette goes with a different type of personality, and it's looking at how you can judge people's personalities by their appearance, which certainly has a danger to it, and that you can start judging people that look like yourself as being some kind of good people and having good personalities, and people that look different from you often get judged as being inferior to oneself or having bad personalities. So this is a rather dangerous approach to take, and we will see that throughout history. But physiognomy was one idea that was popular around this time. And another psychological theory that was popular at the time, or at least initially, it was just popular in Paris, France, and in a few decades it will spread to the United States. And recall that around this time is when France was going through its own revolution. And this is going to be something that's usually the starting point for the story of the history of hypnotism, and also something that's relevant to ideas about treatments for people who experience what we might call psychological disorders, or things like depression or anxiety. So anyway, the story begins with this guy right here, Franz Anton Mesmer. And in the 1780s, he was in Paris, France, and he was a medical doctor, and he did his medical dissertation on a topic that we might find rather unusual today. His medical dissertation was on the influence of the planets on the body via magnetic forces. In other words, he thought things like Mercury and Mars and Venus going around the solar system, that they had magnetic influences on the Earth, and these magnetic influences would influence the body. They would influence people's health. So whether you were sick or healthy could be partly determined by the magnetic forces from the planets going around the solar system. And he was especially interested in magnetism and how magnetism and magnets might influence the body. And which, by the way, this was kind of all the latest rage around this point in history. A lot of people were interested in magnetism and electricity. They were kind of hot scientific topics to pursue. Note, it was just a few years earlier when Benjamin Franklin did his studies, his famous studies with a kite, flying the kite and discovering electricity there. We talked about Galvani and his studies with frog legs. So there was a lot of interest in electricity and also magnetism around this time in history. So Mesmer thought that magnetics were important, for that magnets could heal. They had healing forces. In fact, actually, he had this term called this animal magnetism, was this force he thought was inside of people, and he thought that that by magnets could control this animal magnetism, and that was part of a process that could create healing. And he had this, you might call it a clinic or whatever, his practice in Paris, where he used magnets to heal people. And his idea was that he could use it. Part of what happened is he'd take the magnets and he'd use them to put them in kind of a trance that would activate their animal magnetism. And by putting people in this trance using magnets and activating their animal magnetism, that could heal people. And so here's a picture that's supposed to depict people coming to his clinic or his practice to get healed. And it was he staged it. There was kind of a lot of theatrics with what he did. They would come in. He had this big vat in the middle. I think it had some kind of fluid in it, and he had metal magnetic rods that were in that vat. And he would come in and take the rods out of the vat and wave them across people with the idea that the magnetic fields would help heal them. And I think he was healing people of all kinds. It was both what we might call physical ailments. Maybe someone was in pain, or they had some kind of physical ailment, or they could be depressed or anxious. I think he tried to cure a wide variety of ailments with his magnetic rods. Then eventually he decided that he could heal people without the rods, that he could put people in that trance. He didn't really actually need the magnetic rod, that he could use his own power and put people into that trance and heal them that way. Notably, Benjamin Franklin was actually at one point invited to be part of a commission to go and visit Mesmer's work and try to figure out, was he legitimate or not? And actually, the commission and Benjamin Franklin concluded, no, he's probably not legitimate. He's kind of a quack. We don't really think he's doing what he's claiming to do. And actually, and above and beyond that, they were concerned that he was sexually exploiting young women in his practice. At least that was the conclusion of the commission from Benjamin Franklin. So anyway, Mesmer had, and eventually Mesmer's idea with his magnets and his animal magnetism would eventually be called mesmerism. That's also, I believe, where we get the term mesmerized comes from Mesmer. So that term mesmerized comes from all that. And there's actually a progression of terminology here. So Mesmer talked about animal magnetism. Eventually, this idea of using this animal magnetism to heal people, or you put people into trances, eventually that became called mesmerism. And then eventually that became evolved in what today we would call hypnotism. But if you go back in time, the terms used for hypnotism could be, they talk about using animal magnetism. They talk about people being magnetized, was another term for hypnotism, because they thought it was related to magnets, or mesmerism, or mesmerized, were all different terms that were used many years ago for kind of the same basic type of phenomena. So that was Anton Mesmer and his animal magnetism and his mesmerism. So as long as we're talking about things going on in Paris, France, let's talk about the history of treatments for what today we might call types of mental illness. Now, of course, at this point in history, they would not have used the term mental illness. In the United States, they probably would have used the term insanity. But what were treatments for people with what today might be a diagnosis of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or a severe depression? How were people with these types of problems treated? Certainly, throughout all of human history, people have struggled with trying to find ways to treat people with mental illness. And sometimes these treatments have been terrible, harsh treatments. Sometimes people with mental illness were put in prison-like asylums where they were chained and confined into cells, or maybe not given enough food and clothing to eat and treated almost like animals. But around the time of the American Revolution, a new approach to treatment developed that was called moral therapy. And one of the people that was a promoter of this new type of therapy was Philip Peniel. And here I have a picture of Peniel. And there's also been some famous paintings of Peniel. And here is a painting of Peniel right here in this picture. And we can ask the question, what is he doing? What's going on? So Peniel was, again, a promoter of this new type of approach to treating people with mental illness called moral therapy. And he lived in Paris, France, and he was reportedly interested in things like liberty and equality among people. Supposedly, he served poor people rather than wealthy people. And at one point, he was trying to help someone who was probably suffering with what today we might call some type of a bipolar disorder. But he was trying to help this person, and this person eventually became very manic and ran out into the woods, not wearing very much clothing, and ended up getting killed by wolves in the woods. And Peniel was very distressed by this, as you might imagine, and he became interested in trying to help or find treatments for people with mental illness. And his basic idea was that these types of problems were an actual illness, and that the best help that we could give people with these troubles involves kindness and humane, caring types of treatment. And he began writing about this, and eventually he became director of an asylum called the Bicêtre Asylum in Paris, France. And the Bicêtre Asylum, here we go, Bicêtre, was originally, it was a prison, then it became kind of a poorhouse, but eventually it became essentially an insane asylum for men. And it was one of those places where there were very harsh conditions and people were chained to their cells. And Peniel came in, and his basic idea was people needed to be treated kindly. And so he began removing the chains and releasing people and letting them go free so they could walk about and trying to find kinder ways to treat them. He also removed some of the more harsher types of treatments. Sometimes they do treatments where they whirl people around in machines that makes people probably not feel very well, and cures where they try to douse people with cold water, and types of bloodletting cures that they were going to, and he ended a lot of these types of treatments that he thought were rather harsh and tried to find kind ways to treat people. And supposedly that worked to some degree. Supposedly people got better. Then a few years after that, in 1795, I believe, so this would be a few years after the American Revolution, he became director of La Salpêtrière, which was an asylum for women. So Peniel was in Paris, France. He was a director of these asylums for people with what today we'd call mental illness. And he was instituting this new type of therapy called the moral therapy, where he'd give people kind and gentle, compassionate treatment. Actually, this painting here that we see here is one that was painted in 1849, which is several years after Peniel lived. So it's someone imagining what it might have been like. And here it has kind of, Peniel looks very grand in ordering the removal of the chains of that old man in the picture there. He probably proceeded very cautiously, and there's some reports that he might have actually been out of town when they started removing the chains. So this might not be a perfectly accurate depiction of what happened. Interestingly, there's actually another famous painting of Peniel that I have here. I'll go to this next picture here. Here's another one. So this is in 1878. So this is quite a few years after Peniel actually lived. But here's a painting of Peniel. In this case, if we got into art, it's kind of interesting to see how Peniel is portrayed differently. In this painting, we have Peniel's kind of in the shadows and the spotlight's on that woman who's having her chains released. And then there's also another woman who's kissing Peniel's hand as he's releasing the chains of the people in the asylum. So that's the story of Peniel and the beginnings of moral therapy. And around the same time that Philip Peniel was developing his moral therapy in Paris, France, in England, this person, William Tuke, was developing some similar ideas. Now, William Tuke was a Quaker, and the Quakers were a Christian Protestant religious group that was probably viewed as being somewhat eccentric at this time. Possibly the term Quaker comes from the fact that when they had worship services, they might have moved or shook or got emotional in ways that outsiders thought it looked like they were quaking, would have been the term they use. But more importantly, the Quakers had some distinctive theological ideas. And one of their key theological ideas is that there is this inner light of God that exists in all people. And if there's this inner light of God in all people, that means all people are precious and all people are equal. So one thing we will see is that actually throughout history, that oftentimes Quakers are a group of people that are promoting ideas of human equality. We'll see this eventually when we talk about the abolitionist movement opposing slavery in the United States. A lot of the early abolitionists were Quakers. I believe if you go to a Quaker worship service, their format is one that does not have a leader giving a sermon or a pastor or a preacher or a priest over everybody else, but rather it's a service that's focused on the idea of equality where everyone sits quietly, and then if anyone feels inspired to speak and say something, that person can stand up and speak and then sit back down again. Another thing about the Quakers is that they often call each other friends, is the key term they use to call other members of the Quaker group. They call each other friends, again, focusing on that idea of we're all equal and we all have this inner light of God within us. So anyway, William Tuke he had a friend who had some type of mental disorder or difficulty and ended up getting put in this asylum in York. And William Tuke went to visit his friend, and he was appalled by the conditions in this asylum where his friend was put. And so William Tuke decided we need to do something better. We need to make this retreat, this idea for people with what today we would call mental illness, this type of retreat where they can come and receive kind, compassionate care. So they developed this retreat called the York Retreat. And at the York Retreat in England, established by William Tuke, was a retreat for people with how he termed it was people afflicted with disorders of the mind, was how they termed it. And they were given freedom, they were given kindness, they were given recreation, they were given things to do, they were given exercise. It was a farm where they could go outside and do things. And they were also given some religious instruction, was all wrapped up in the package as well. And so the idea was that when people are afflicted with these mental disorders, if we use this kind of kind, compassionate care, this new moral therapy might be the type of treatment that they need. As we'll see, this is a wonderful idea, but it ended up not working out as well as we would have hoped it would have. But it certainly was a good idea. And with that, we'll wrap up our discussion of things going on around the time of the American Revolution. And in our next video, we'll start with the decade of the 1800s.